Sorry,
Love
I'm not worried. Yeah, y'all good.
love again. Oh, baby, that is just nourishing. That is. Oh, this was the correct choice.
Also, if you could, just a reminder, if everyone can go on mute. Great. Thank you all for being so patient and waiting, and for joining us tonight. We are very excited for our panel today. My name is Kimberly Gonzalez. I use she and her pronouns. I am with Law for Black Lives, and I'm the operations director. Law for Black Lives is a network of about 4,000 lawyers, legal workers, and law students who are out in the world working to transform the legal field, transform the law, and help support Black-based building organizations. This webinar is our third installment of our summer school webinar series, and we'll be talking about criminalizing protests today. Just a reminder, if you are not on mute, if you could please mute your phones, that would be great. Thank you all so much. Yeah, and look out for our next series. It's starting next month. We're going to be starting with a Freedom to Thrive webinar. And you can all join us for a discussion about our work with movement partners to repeal and replace the 1994 crime bill and invest in our communities. We have a really dope panel for you all today. I'll go ahead and do some introductions. We're waiting on our co-host to join. Oh wait, there he is. So actually, sorry about that. Dwight, can you hear us? Dwight, if you're talking, you have to hit *6 to unmute.
What about now?
There we go. Okay. I'm going to hand it over to you. I already opened this up, so take it away. Dwight, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm passing it over to you.
I'm sorry, guys, for dropping the ball. Good Good evening. My name is Dwight Lacey. I currently serve on the executive board of Law for Black Lives D.C. We've been around pretty much since the initial conference that was held in New York City the summer after Eric Garner died. We began meeting informally after we broke off from those regional caucuses. If you guys, were fortunate enough to attend, and it was definitely a powerful conference. So since then, we've essentially grown into an organization based in DC with our goal of basically eradicating white supremacy. And our central mission is to focus on providing free legal advice to the activists in the city. We've developed partnerships with a number of organizations that were around before many of us moved to Washington, D.C. A majority of us are transplants, to be honest. And so we help local organizations known as BYP 100, PACA, and other organizations in the city, Keep DC for Me, Stop Police Terror Project. So if there's ever a situation where they want to challenge proposed legislation or even propose potential legislation themselves, we help walk them through that process. If there are issues with folks that have been arrested, we run a jail support line for protesters in the city. We also conduct legal observer training to have more, for lack of a better term, neutral on-site folks that are at organizing actions, just in case the activity escalates and we need an independent report separate from the police report of actually what happened. So, you're attending the protest, but you're not necessarily participating in it. And we've done those trainings in conjunction with the National Lawyers Guild. Today, the majority of this the majority of this panel and this webinar is focusing on criminalizing protest and, criminalizing protests in the ultimate goal of mass liberation, right? And I'm sure, and I hope most of you on the phone or dialed in have heard about the designation Black Identity Extremism. But I wanted to start off just to make sure that everyone knows that this is nothing new. And the points that I wanted to highlight, starting off with Marcus Garvey, when he arrived in New York City in 1916, he went directly to Harlem, pre the Harlem Renaissance era, and began to preach the concepts and thoughts of Black pride and economic justice. And that picked him up on the radar of the American Protective League, which was actually a private organization, which then later referred his name to what was the Bureau of Investigation, which eventually grew into the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. J. Edgar Hoover was the assistant to the Attorney General at the age of 24, beginning in 1919. So all of this coincided around the same time. And J. Edgar Hoover led the FBI up until his death in 1972. So a number of the things that we're seeing today, right, have their roots embedded in surveillance of African American activists, right? So it's nothing new. Although the title is rooted in a paper that was discovered in 2017, and then most recently, the director of the FBI, Christopher Wray, announced in his most recent, I think it was in July 2019, late July 2019, he announced that FBI is going to abandon the Black Identity Extremism designation. It's nothing new, and that's honestly what we face. Although that designation may be abandoned, it wasn't called Black Identity Extremism in Garvey's time. It wasn't called Black Identity Extremism in Dr. King's time or Malcolm Shabazz's time, or it wasn't called Black Identity Extremism when the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense were leading their charge and were based out of Chicago, and then ultimately led to Fred Hampton's murder in his apartment, right? So that's just the framework that I wanted to frame this in, as though this distinction is something that we heard of recently in the last few years. And also, even though that there have been arrests made, if you followed the story of Christopher Daniels out of Dallas, Texas, he also goes by the name of Rakeem Bulagan. He started an organization called the Huey Newton Gun Club, and based upon his Facebook activity and right around the time when police officers in Dallas, Texas were murdered, and the statuses that he posted, he was one of the first people to be arrested and spent about 6 months in jail based upon a BIE designation. He was eventually released in May 2018. What they attempted to track his history with was that he had a 2007 misdemeanor for he had a 2007 misdemeanor. He had a 2007 misdemeanor in Tennessee for domestic violence. So 10 years later, they attempt to track this misdemeanor to follow that history all the way to him to say he didn't have the right to possess a gun in Texas. So I think that adequately lays the framework of where we're going to go.
Great, thank you so much, Dwight. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists to you all, and then we'll kick off the conversation. Ajua Ayatoro is an activist attorney with extensive experience working domestically and internationally to obtain remedies for historic and present-day wrongs to people of color, women, prisoners, and other oppressed groups. She's professor emerita of the University of Arkansas Little Rock William H. Bowen School of Law. Ajua was the inaugural director of the University of Arkansas's Little Rock's Institute on Race and Ethnicity. She's a lifetime member of the National Conference of Black Lawyers and has served as co-chairperson of its board and as its national director. She's also a co-facilitator of the Black Identity Extremist Abolition Collective. Sukti Dittal is a human rights lawyer and the deputy director of the Bernstein Institute for Human Rights at NYU School of Law, a human rights center dedicated to advancing legal empowerment and defending dissent through innovative research, education, and advocacy. Sukti also serves as a supervising attorney with the Global Justice Clinic at NYU Law, where she oversees projects on legal empowerment and digital surveillance of human rights defenders. Previously, Sukti was the executive director and co-founder of Nazdik, an award-winning legal empowerment organization committed to bringing access to justice closer to marginalized communities in India. Omar Faraz, a senior staff attorney at the Center for Constitutional Rights, and is the lead lawyer in Color of Change versus the Department of Homeland Security and Federal Bureau of Investigation, which seeks records that reveal the government's expansive surveillance of the movement for Black lives. Omar focuses on an array of CCR's litigation and advocacy in response to abusive policing and counterterrorism practices, including the unlawful surveillance of Muslim American communities, the criminalization of dissent, and systemic unlawful policing practices. Liz Jackson is a founding staff attorney for Palestine Legal. Her work focuses on growing the field of movement lawyers to support activists organizing for Palestinian freedom and related justice movements. She defends the right to boycott, bolsters the free speech of students, professors, and activists, documents the chilling effects of repression campaigns, and creates ways for lawyers to strengthen movements for liberation. She has organized for Palestinian human rights as a member of Students for Justice in Palestine and a Jewish solidarity activist. Before school at Berkeley Law, she organized with immigrant communities in Massachusetts to build power. Carl Williams is a movement lawyer dedicated to creating the conditions where people are free from all systems of oppression. Carl has practiced criminal and civil rights law in Massachusetts for over 12 years. He began his legal career as a criminal defense attorney with the Roxbury Defenders. More recently, he served as a racial justice attorney with the ACLU of Massachusetts, and he is currently the executive director of the Water Protector Legal Collective, defending Indigenous movements that are defending the earth and water. He is a member of the National Lawyers Guild and currently serves as co-chair of its Massachusetts board. In 2015, he served on the working group that organized the inaugural Law for Black Lives convening and was a featured speaker in its Rad Talk events. Carl was a Gilbert Distinguished Lecturer on Public Interest Law at Northeastern University School of Law and a practitioner in residence at Cornell Law, teaching a course on the history and theory of movement lawyering. Leola Cowboy is a citizen of the Dine Nation, born to the Saltwater Clan. Leola testified at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights hearing on the criminalization of Indigenous people fighting resource extraction and worked with various groups on dismantling settler colonialism. Currently, she is an organizer for the Water Protector Legal Collective, a prison abolitionist, and an active member of the No DAPL Political Prisoner Support Committee. So thank you all so much for joining us. We're really excited to get into it. And with that, I'll pass it over to Sukti.
Great, thanks so much. Hi, everybody. My name is Sukti, as Kim noted, and it's really great to be here with you all. Big thanks to Law for Black Lives for the opportunity to join in what is a very real and very urgent conversation, though obviously very historical as well, around the crackdown on dissent. And I'm going to be talking a bit about what that looks like at the global level, and kind of harkening back to my days as a human rights practitioner who worked alongside communities in India which India kind of is known as this world's largest democracy, but in action is increasingly more and more becoming an authoritarian state. And so experienced firsthand some of the ways in which the states, often in coordination with companies, are using laws and policies, threats, harassment tactics to silence protest and expression. And then now sitting at the Bernstein Institute for Human Rights at NYU Law School, where we partner with grassroots activists and academics across the globe to really help kind of outline what are some of the measures and tactics that governments are using to silence. And also, conversely, what are ways in which folks are resisting? So what are strategies and tactics that folks are using as a way to, I wouldn't say expand space for dissent, because we're seeing increasingly that becoming smaller, but even just to be able to exist and continue to engage is a huge win in the current state of affairs. So what I was asked to do is to provide a mini snapshot of the global trends, which I always find very difficult to do. So apologies for what sometimes comes across as kind of vague generic statements, but I'm going to try my best to provide a little bit of a mini snapshot and then go a little deep in two places that I'm sure a lot of folks are seeing. Well, one in Hong Kong and kind of what's happening there, and another that's getting a little bit less coverage, which is in Zimbabwe, where we have partners on the ground, and I've been in talks with them to get a sense of what they're experiencing, and then ways in which folks are really resisting in resilient and creative ways. So at a top level, this is quote unquote the 13th year of decline in global freedom. So this organization called Freedom House monitors what's happening within civic space. So these kind of traditional fundamental freedoms that fall under that. And we're seeing the 13th year for which that's shrinking. Manakaya, who is the former UN Special Rapporteur on the rights to freedom of assembly and association, was heavily quoted for noting that we're in a period of democratic recession. Civicus, which is much more of a social movement-based organization that looks at civic freedoms and it monitors with grassroots organizations in over 20 plus countries, found that in this 2018-2019 period, civil society is under attack in 111 countries, and only 4% of the world's population lives in a space that is quote unquote open. So what's happening? How is this erosion kind of experience? How are we seeing this kind of erosion? And there's a few different ways, none of which I think is going to be too illuminating to folks on the call, but states are passing new laws. And then they're arbitrarily applying existing laws, particularly with respect to freedom of assembly, both online and offline. So I think where we're seeing kind of history, the new kind of digital warfare is using a lot of cyber content restrictions and surveillance online. But as we heard earlier, none of the surveillance is really new. And there are really, what we found that I think is really important is that these states, these countries are actually sharing strategies amongst each other. So what might be a roadmap in Russia to quash organizations, to restrict NGOs from operating, to pass anti-terrorism laws, are then being exported to somewhere like Ethiopia, which are then picked up. We're seeing it starting to percolate here in the United States. And so there's really a network of states that are talking to each other and sharing these kind of strategies of exporting these different types of laws and policies. And that's resulting in the shutdown of organizations. That's resulting in extra legal forms of harassment and intimidation of defenders. And the term defenders is so broad. I mean, of course, the most vulnerable and marginalized are at the kind of have the double, triple impact, but you're even seeing like women, quote unquote, self-help groups that are seen as controversial to state. You're seeing public health advocates in Mexico that are pushing for a corporate tax being surveilled. So it's widening who's getting impacted. And then you're seeing arbitrarily people getting deemed as terrorists, as those who are engaging in money laundering. And all of this is justified under the guise of kind of law and order, combating terrorism, and protecting this notion of state sovereignty, and pushing back against Western imperialism. And this is moving beyond Russia, China, Ethiopia, to the United States and other countries like India and Kenya. And the impact is huge. It's, of course, arbitrary arrest and detention, resulting in many cases of torture and in some cases death. It's shutting down of organizations and the kind of thriving movements. And it's resulting in a quieting effect where folks who would otherwise want to engage are fearful to engage because of the potential impacts of their resistance. So how are people responding? We're seeing from different conversations and reports and others, really creatively. In Hong Kong, you're seeing a flooding of the streets. You're seeing that this idea that if there are enough folks out there, perhaps it becomes near impossible to police and criminalize that behavior. You're seeing examples of satire of government action, kind of ridiculizing what the government is doing through art and creative protesting. And I'll give a couple of examples of that in Hong Kong and in Zimbabwe. You're of course seeing the use of the internet, which in many ways is a tool of surveillance, but in other ways has still continued to be a form of resistance. Whether it be just kind of sharing what's happening outside of these borders, to actually deciding next steps. Like, what are we gonna do as a community with respect to our protest and our resistance efforts? And there's some really exciting examples of that in Hong Kong. You're seeing, of course, the naming and shaming of international advocacy, which has limited impacts, but just getting the word out. You're seeing really broad-based coalitions, and you're seeing communities actually engaged in the documentation and the monitoring of violations and abuse, what we call, where I work, legal empowerment efforts. So in the little bit of time I have left, I'm just gonna go take a few steps into Hong Kong and call out some of the strategies that I think are really exciting that they're engaged in. So many of you have probably seen in the news that there's been about 12 weeks of just consistent protesting on the streets in Hong Kong. Hundreds of thousands of people are out. One of them had a record, I think, about 2 million people who were flooding the streets. It was like more than a quarter of the island's population. And it's really centered, it was sparked in part by this extradition law, where the Legislative Council was exploring whether or not they were very close to passing a bill that would have allowed for adjudication of certain cases for folks to be extradited to places like mainland China to have their cases heard. And that, of course, brings a lot of fear in terms of the increasing encroachment of mainland China and what was supposed to be some sort of democratic sovereignty that Hong Kong was to have preserved under the agreements that enabled it to be out of British control. And so this fear of kind of increasing mainland China dominance was a spark, and it led to, as I mentioned, hundreds of thousands of people protesting. And on June 15th, the chief executive says the bill is dead, but that's not enough because it was never withdrawn. And so that continued this sustained protesting where to date, they're on their 12th week. I mean, even though this has been in many ways inspiring, I think for all of us here in the States, there's been, of course, harm. Over 800 people have been arrested and detained and charged under what we commonly see as those public order ordinances. And I think this is where the strategies are really similar. You have to apply for a permit. The permit either gets denied and you continue with your protest, or the permit is approved, but then any sort of action that they deem as violent is classified as a riot. And in Hong Kong, if it's classified as a riot, you can have up to 10 years of prison time. So it's really a vehicle of control and a way to kind of instill fear within people. And also there's been some pretty pervasive ways in which the mainland China is kind of infiltrating in ways. They're framing Hong Kongers as violent, as rioters, as trying to become independent fully, which is actually not the majority opinion at the moment. Most people are not kind of demanding to be an independent state, but they're just demanding that the actual agreement of them having some democratic sovereignty be in place. You're seeing China come in and kind of influence through financial firms and corporations. Employees have been directed, law students, people in law firms to scrub their social media. If there's anything online that looks like they might be aligning with the protest, that's seen as a form of dissent, and that could result in people losing their jobs, which is what happened in Cathay Pacific, which is one of Hong Kong's airlines. So it's super complicated because of the background roles of these geopolitical actors. And in this example, it would be China. And so while people are continuing their demands, which is full withdrawal, which is to not have the earlier protests deemed as riots, but to have them be seen as lawful, that would result in full amnesty of those who've been charged, and also looking into full investigations of police misconduct. So those are ongoing. When I was talking to a few of our friends on the ground, they're saying that they don't see that ending, that people have continued to feel really motivated. They feel like this is the moment. Either they feel like they're at a tipping point of kind of what does it mean for China to continuously come in. And so I think that there seems to be still a lot of energy, and who's protesting are largely young people and then people over 60. And it's a whole range of groups. There was like an accountants-led march. There was medical professionals that were doing stuff. There were lawyers. There were workers in a garment factory. So it's a really hybrid and diverse group of folks who are feeling compelled to kind of engage. And if those who are not engaging kind of on the streets are donating, for example, colored clothes that have that are not black, because if you wear black clothes and you have a hard hat, you are getting picked up because you look like you're a protester. So people are dropping off bags of colored clothes on the street, so people have different things to wear. Once they've protested, they put on like a colored t-shirt and they continue on their day. So ways in which to figure out how to build solidarity. And what's super interesting about this is that it's truly, they're saying leaderless. It is an anonymous group of folks who often are determining strategies on these private message boards. So they have voting and they say, okay, I think we should do X next. And then people put that out on these message boards, and then tons of people vote on whether or not that makes sense. So an example, I shared an article about laser points. They were basically, one individual was picked up and charged with holding a criminal weapon because he had a laser gun in his hand. And folks have been using that to when police have come close. And so that was deemed as a criminal weapon, and the guy was charged, and everyone thought that was insane. And so a bunch of them, someone voted on one of these message boards that let's actually all take laser points and surround a museum as a way of kind of showing how ridiculous this is and a way of response. And they did that, and it's an example of kind of a creative way in which to respond to government action. Other things they've done is kind of look backwards historically. So in the Balkan Islands 20 years ago, people held hands across the island. They did the same thing in Hong Kong. And they're also kind of showing up for non-political purposes, using religion and other forms of organizations as rationale for collectivizing. I would love to keep going, Kim, but I think I'm coming close to my end. So I'm happy to share some more examples. Zimbabwe has some really interesting work, and I was going to talk about India, but we're out of time. So I am happy to answer questions. Please feel free to send anything along the chat. I can share my email address, and then would love to stay connected to you all, because this is obviously such a live issue. And there is some really interesting work happening outside of the US that we should really look to, I think, to help us kind of think through how we can be as resilient. I see some stuff coming through. So Kim, should I just pick up that on the way out, or?
Yeah, I can share with you the questions that folks asked. And then
Okay.
if you wanted to share your email, you can go ahead and just drop it in the chat for folks.
I'll do that now. All right, thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much. And we'll go ahead and pass it to Ajwa.
Hi. I want to join in thanking Law for Black Lives, John Sifty, and thanking Law for Black Lives for holding this important webinar, and also for inviting National Conference of Black Lawyers to be a part of it. I wanted to focus on, and I was asked to focus on, the kind of criminalization of protest and radical politics in this 20th century until today. Dwight gave a kind of an overview of some of the points that I'll go a little bit more in depth on. But one of the points I really wanted to make is that, to start off with, is that the criminalization is not really necessarily just a protest. It's a criminalization of activism. And it's a criminalization of the activism that challenges the fundamental principles of a white supremacist capitalist country. And this has been since the very beginning, so it even predates the 20th century. I will focus my comments on that, one, because of the short time, and two, because of what I was asked to do. But we see it, if we really want to start, we can actually see it. It's parallel to the way in which slave uprisings were, one, found out about, or rebellions were found out about before they occurred, through surveillance and snitches and all of that, and the way they were handled, the violent way they were handled, and they were handled in that way, much like the way the activists in the 20th century were handled, to actually serve as what we call legally, I know everyone on the call is not a lawyer, but a chilling effect. So it wasn't only just these actions in the 20th century and into the 21st century are not just done to individuals or to protest groups just against them. It's done to prevent or to attempt to prevent further protests. So it's to chill further protests. We can start really in the 20th century, even before the FBI was actually formed, which was founded in 1908. The Bureau of Investigation, which is the precursor to the FBI. But we can start with the reparations movement and the formation in 1897 of a group organization was called the Ex-Slave Mutual Relief Bounty and Pension Association, led by I.H. Dickerson and Callie House. And this group was organized to work towards an attempt to get passage of a bill that would give pensions to ex-slaves or their families, and also forms of reparations, which the pensions were viewed as some form, but forms of reparations. And this group was actually really under the Federal Post Office Department. They were accused of defrauding their members. Basic argument being that it was impossible for them to get reparations and the pensions, so they're defrauding their members by having circulating flyers and members joining and providing money for something that, in quotes, they said was impossible. And there's some background to even why that was even ludicrous. One of the sources that I looked at, in fact, said that for lack of any evidence, really, they were accused, and in fact, both Callie House and Isaiah Dickerson were charged and convicted of things. He, in 1901, he was convicted of fraud, and it was overturned later. And Callie House, in 1917, served from November 1917 to August of 1918 because she was convicted of fraud and incarcerated in Jefferson City, Missouri Penitentiary. So these, again, this is to destabilize a movement. This is to have a chilling effect and to destabilize the movement. All of these things that we're going to talk about, that I'm talking about briefly, and Dwight highlighted, were not just injuries to the, like the person was, the activist was jailed. The activist, he talked about Rakeem Balakoon, which I'll get to in a minute. But we have to understand, and I know we all probably do, that the injury goes far beyond that individual. It injures their families. It injures their communities. So the other thing, after we deal with the early 1900s with Callie House and Isaiah Dickerson and the Ex-Slave Mutual Relief, Bounty, and Pension Association, we come to the formation under the Bureau of Investigation was formed, the organization, the arm that was led by Hoover in August of 1919. He became the head of its new General Intelligence, well, it's called the General Intelligence Division, but it was also known as the Radical Division because its goal was to monitor and disrupt the work of domestic radicals. And we know, that he in that department, he investigated, monitored, and disrupted the work of Marcus Garvey and his movement. We know that there's some evidence that he later on began looking at other so-called radicals or so-called activists who, not so-called activists, who were attempting to obtain justice and human rights and fair treatment, not just the Marcus Garvey movement. And then we know that in 1956, under his leadership, he became really then what was then called the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He developed the counterintelligence programs that we call COINTELPRO. And these programs not only work to destabilize, to disrupt the black civil rights movement, human rights movement, but it also was focused on the American Indian movement, the Puerto Rican independistas, environmental activists, and other forms of activism. What we know more about, at least many of us study more about the disruptions in the black liberation movements, from the attempts to destabilize and get Martin Luther King to commit suicide, his anonymous messages to Coretta Scott King to destroy their marriage are well known. He dealt with Malcolm X. He was also, of course, the big thing is, not the only thing, but the big thing that we know about is the Black Panther Party. We talked about, Dwight mentioned Fred Hampton. One of the things that's interesting, some of the research I did a little while ago about Fred Hampton and other Black Panthers is part of the need. They infiltrated the Black Panther Party and the various chapters throughout the country. And, of course, part of the murder of Fred Hampton was made primarily possible because he was infiltrated, and in fact his bodyguard was in fact an agent. But the interesting thing is, if you look at it and look at it from the perspective, as I do and many of us do, from movement disruption, Fred Hampton was beginning to organize not just black people, but he was developing in Chicago a multiracial activist groupings and really becoming a leader of that, in the sense of getting some fundamental change, not just, the Black Panthers, which was good enough. I mean, I'm not undermining or demeaning the Black Panthers at all, but to show that the real fear was, much like the fear with Martin Luther King, I believe with Malcolm X and others, is that will they actually go beyond even the, in quotes, just the black grievances, so to speak. And I think that's true even with Callie House, even though she was focused on pensions, that their group was focused on pensions for black people. In organizing, she not only organized what they called ex-slaves, I would call formerly enslaved people, but they were also organizing and getting support from whites. And one, I'm blanking on the guy's name, I should have looked it up, a congressperson was in fact getting ready to, or was in the process of, in fact, introducing a bill to support their movement. So if we look at all that COINTELPRO did, what happened, COINTELPRO supposedly ended in 1971. It was a secret program, unlike is similar to the Black Identity Extremist Assessment that was issued in the spring of 2017 and made public in November of 2017. But it was unlike that BIE assessment, the Black Identity Extremist Assessment that was public, and the FBI and other federal agencies and individuals are acting really publicly. They were public with Bala Kun. But the COINTELPRO was supposedly secret, and in fact the Senate Select Committee to study government operations with respect to intelligence activities held a hearing. And in 1976, they found, as a result of their hearing, held a number of hearings, that they were engaged in, that the FBI was engaged in illegal and undemocratic activities to combat perceived threats. I'm quoting from the hearing now, from the report, to combat perceived threats to the existing social and political order. So the purpose of these of COINTELPRO, the purpose of Hoover's radical division, the purpose of the attacks on the Callie House's organization and Dickerson's organization, the reparations group, the purpose from the beginning, even before it was the FBI, was to, in fact, perceive threats to the existing social order. I mean, reparations for what? You were our slaves. Why should we do anything? Why should we allow you to legitimize the fact that you were injured by this government, severely injured? So if we go through and we see that it was supposedly ended in 71, but there's some credible evidence that, of course, COINTELPRO never really ended. And one point, and I wanted to pull up, and I couldn't find it as quickly as I needed to, but the term Black Identity Extremist is really not a new term. It has been used in the past. So they didn't even invent a new term. Many of us thought it was a new term until some records and documents were recently released back a couple of months ago, and so that is not even a new term. And the purpose of these, up until what Christopher Daniel was Balagoon's name, but he used that name, but he had changed his name to Rakeem Balagoon. And the purpose of all of this is really not only the destabilization of the movement, but to actually discredit it. It's to say that somehow when we as blacks, and the article I put up I think is real important, and she goes into a lot of detail on this topic, not a lot because it's just 17 pages, by Natsu Sato, but part of it is criminalizing our involvement in our support of our identity, so to speak, blacks and Native Americans, Puerto Ricans supporting their own liberation and human rights. And so it undermines, it conflates, I guess is the point she's making, which I think is a great point. It conflates actually white extremism with black extremists. And so it says, even though the evidence is in all the examples the FBI has given, that in fact the groups that they are targeting are not black groups, are not violent groups, but because they are supporting fundamental changes in this country, like in racism, fundamental change, you were formed on racism, in the major economic disparities and all of that becomes a challenge, not. And so we conflate it with white extremism, but it's just totally different, but it's a way of diminishing and actually stripping, telling a lie that strips the integrity of these movements and criminalizes the movements, and the movements being a movement to get human rights and the basic fundamental rights of oppressed groups. So the question really is, we don't know the answer to, we have the example, the current example in 2018 of Rakeem Balagoon, but we don't know really. That's one of the fights, and I know CCR, ACLU, other groups have been involved with attempting just to get the information on what are they doing, who are they surveilling, and they put up a pretty big wall that we have to beat down. But the Black Identity Extremist Abolition Collective that was mentioned in my bio is a collective that came out of an NCPL board meeting in 2018. And part of what we're doing as a collective and involved in the collective actively are the National Conference of Black Lawyers, Transformative Justice Coalition, Defending Rights and Dissent, Stop LAPD Spying, Media Justice, and the National Lawyers Guild, in addition to the national, the D.C. and Maryland chapters, and others are associated with it. We've worked with a broader network, CCR, and other groups came together on a conference call some months ago. And so we are having some working relationships there. But the biggest thing, and I think we're going to get to this question later, in terms of right now, like the question for me was from in the early 20th century till today, is we don't know what's happening. We have significant support for the assumption, at least, and I don't know if there's data that's come out or information that I don't know about, but information that, for example, Black Lives Matter is being surveilled. Surprise, surprise. But we don't actually know from what information that we have, and I'm hoping some groups are getting more information, and maybe even if other groups, Omar and others, can talk about it on this call if we do have it. But that's the real danger. We know it, but we don't know it. And so the history for me is that it started way back even before the 20th century. It's going to continue anytime our organizations and their leaders, the activists of leadership, challenge the fundamental bases of a white supremacist capitalist government. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we will pass to Omar. Oh, Omar, you're on mute.
I was just asking someone to wave frantically if I was on mute. Hi, everyone. Really happy to be here and excited for this already rich conversation. Thanks so much to the Law for Black Lives organizers for having the vision to create a space like this where we can reflect and share. I assume that at least some on the call might not know the Center for Constitutional Rights. So just quickly, we're roughly a 53-year-old organization, legal and advocacy organization born out of the movement for racial equality in the South. Some of the proudest moments in the early days are representing Fannie Lou Hamer and suing the KKK in Tennessee, and much more recently working with just a group of fearless organizers and movement actors to challenge the NYPD's stop and frisk policy. But after the September 11th attacks, a lot of our institutional focus and resources were devoted to combating what, for lack of a better word, we often call counterterrorism policy. And that's sort of my own point of entry for this work around the targeting of Black political speech under the Black Identity Extremism designation in its current form, or in the many other iterations that Adjoa just laid out. And I represent men who've been detained at Guantanamo for 17 years now without charge or trial on the basis almost entirely of identity. Again, no non-Muslim man has ever been detained at Guantanamo. And working here in the tri-state area and beyond around the surveillance of the Muslim community. It's been a very useful sort of framing and sort of point of departure in understanding what's happening around Black political speech. So I thought what I would do is just, in the interest of time, talk quickly about CCR's work with Color of Change and the Freedom of Information Act case that we've been working on that produced the race paper, which I think is a close cousin to whatever it was that was released to Foreign Policy and the other revelations that have come out since, and then try to offer some high-level reflections on what I take away from the documents that I've been able to see. And I want to say at the outset, I know this is the lived experience for a lot of the folks on the call, and so respect and salute for all of the work that you've been doing. Some of the things that came out to us through Color of Change in the immediate sort of aftermath of the uprising in Ferguson was this, the sort of gray space where surveillance starts to meet outright intimidation by law enforcement actors, right? So people, involved in the movement for Black Lives, leaving protest spaces only to be met, at their local grocery store, for example, by local law enforcement and spoken to by their first and last name, right? So making it abundantly clear that they were known entities for the kind of activity that they were taking. Again, First Amendment protected activity. And so the charge to us was to try to understand how it is that local law enforcement is able to act with that kind of specificity and clarity in the way that people were acting and protesting. To just try to peel back this nexus between federal law enforcement agencies and local law enforcement. And so we filed the Freedom of Information Act case that was organized around substance on the one hand and then localities on the other, right? So we were looking for documents that related to the movement for Black Lives, related to racial inequity, related to protest activity around police killing and police violence, and then also targeted the 10 or 11 cities where anti-police violence protests had been the most pitched. And over time, as the federal agency started to produce documents, we got some insight into the scope of surveillance and I think more importantly into the analytical framework that the intelligence agencies are using to target Black political speech. On the absurd end of the spectrum, we identified documents that show that a protest against a protest for a gender-neutral bathroom policy at a Walmart in Maine. And I think, if memory serves, on Facebook, one person registered to attend that protest, but also used the hashtag BLM, was swept up in an FBI document and then put into a field report that gets funneled out to local law enforcement agencies with the proviso to be extra vigilant in the area of that kind of political activity. So absurd on one hand, but also obviously very chilling in terms of how easy it is to infiltrate and to monitor organizations through online activity and social media. And then on the absolutely chilling end of the spectrum, right, we uncovered the race paper, which was produced to us in entirely blacked out form. The only reason we know anything about it was because there were cover emails attached that were between DHS officials talking about various drafts of the race paper and the potential significance of the race paper, and this term that I'll come back to later, quote unquote, the drivers and indicators section of the race paper that merited some in-person meetings. Because of an exception to the Freedom of Information Act statute that permits the government to withhold documents so long as they are in draft incomplete form, we weren't able to actually see the contents of that document, but DHS did file a declaration that gave us a little bit of insight behind it. I think it's important to recognize at the outset the specific agency within DHS that was generating this document, and it was called the Intelligence and Analysis Unit, which by statute is mandated with creating the counterterrorism law enforcement framework that then gets farmed out into the rest of the intelligence community. And so, as we're all involved in this exercise of trying to understand what is the reach of this thinking about Black-led political speech, it's important to pay really close attention to where it is in the national security apparatus, where it is in the intelligence community that this stuff is coming from. So that was sort of like first indication that this is something really quite unsettling. The declaration described it as an analysis, again, in their assessment, an aborted analysis of the growth of domestic race-based terrorism, and included, again, their sort of framing was that it addressed potential threats from all kinds of communities, but I think that's patently false from, not just from the history that Ajwa just laid out about the kind of reflexive targeting of Black political speech in this country, but because what we've seen, activists have seen on the ground. The documents that just were released through the Young Turks, I think, when you sort of combine that with the leaked BIE document that went to foreign policy and the information that's come out through our case, I think it gives you some ability to try to put together a picture of what it is that law enforcement and the intelligence communities are really doing with Black political speech in this particular setting. And the first observation I make is that I think what this is, I think the place to start is with this shift from a law enforcement paradigm that is designed to investigate and arrest and then prosecute criminal activity that's already happened, to this predictive policing model that happens in times of crisis, either real crisis, right? So if you think about the Muslim community and the Masa community in the wake of the September 11th attacks, or invented crises like perfectly legitimate and in fact desperately needed Black political speech around police violence, becomes sort of the predicate step for moving into this model where we have to the law enforcement has to try to figure out criminal activity before it happens. And I think that's sort of a red flag, because the step that follows that, right, is it puts other potential allies, sympathetic actors in the shoes of the state, right? It renders the cost to those targeted communities either negotiable. So maybe, sure, you have a First Amendment right to protest against police violence, but because you're quote unquote a Black identity extremist, the risk, or because Black identity extremism, for example, is out there in the world, and that's a real existential threat to the state, the cost to the communities that are engaged in this kind of otherwise legitimate political speech is something that we have to put to one side for a moment till we get out of this crisis, or it renders the costs entirely invisible. And so, again, I think that the overall work that the BIE framing is doing is to sort of create this myth and stigma around otherwise legitimate Black political speech, and make it perceived as utterly threatening, and therefore worth surveilling, worth targeting, and worth putting down in some respect. The other thing about it, I think, is if you look at the indicators section of the documents that the Young Turks website just put out, and again, indicators is just one of those words that jumps off the page to me from in my perspective, in my past work, right? It's one of those things that signals a framing that can get applied to identity that law enforcement can pretend allows them to predict criminality. And again, it's almost always done on the basis of some crude stereotype or assessment of a particular targeted identity's proclivity towards violence. But what's baked in through that indicator section is this notion that I think Adjo was just touching on, which is one of the sort of signals is a perception that there is injustice, right? That there's racial injustice in the country, that there's race-based police violence in this country, and then that's worth speaking out about, that's worth organizing around, right? And so if that's the predicate that the intelligence community is using to think about the threats as they emanate from otherwise legitimate and desperately needed Black political speech, you see what a deficit or what a hole Black organizers and Black movements are working in when thinking about law enforcement and the intelligence community. Just some of the other indicators in the document, again, are really, really sort of troubling. So one is quote unquote operational security measures. So, taking a battery out of your cell phone if you're in movement spaces, or, being concerned that new people in your movement space might not be there with the best of intentions, and being concerned that they might be recording you. Operating or opting into Black only spaces, right? In a way that so many movements in this particular time of sort of political crisis and repression are using identity-specific spaces to build sort of the genesis of their movement before broadening it. Like that in and of itself can be an indicator that you're sort of on this spectrum towards Black identity extremism. That to me is sort of like it's the mirror image of exactly the things that we saw in the NYPD surveillance of the Muslim community, where totally innocuous behavior becomes a signal of someone's quote unquote radicalization, and therefore makes them worthy of additional scrutiny and attention. And some of the other indicators in the document, right, are about criminal, objectively criminal behavior. But if that criminal behavior then becomes a signal of some larger threat matrix, it justifies a level of scrutiny that makes us all sort of vulnerable to police action, right? If law enforcement watches you 24 hours a day, guarantee all of us on this call are going to be guilty of something. And I think that's kind of what makes this such a scary proposition. It invites this unrelenting scrutiny of Black organizing and of Black identity and Black spaces. And I think ultimately that's that's sort of what this is about, and it's what requires, I think, sort of effective organizing and the kind of building that's happening on this call. The impact, right, is to raise the stakes of speaking out so high that some are just not willing to do it. And the impact is also to create this presumption that building, right, movement building, organizing, recognizing common cause with people and getting organized around some specific objectives is itself an expression of this illegality. And that is, has been a massive challenge to organizers, both in the Black space and certainly in the Masa community for a while, right? Some of the most disheartening and sort of tragic results of the surveillance of the Muslim community has been a presumption that new Muslims in organizing spaces are presumptively threatening, presumptively risky, and the kind of folks that you need to be particularly cautious about. And so when you think about how you actually build movements, this is the kind of framework that cuts right at the very heart of it. And I think that's largely the point. In terms of strategy, I think, legal efforts to uncover the reach of this kind of framework are important. It's certainly not at all the most important thing, but I do think it's worth thinking about ways that Freedom of Information Act kinds of litigation can help give ammunition to movements where the real action is taking place and where the real accountability is taking place, to help inform and arm and hold some, hold law enforcement feet to the fire, right? It's great to see specific and direct questioning about the kind of analytical framework that I think most of the intelligence community is really happy to do behind closed doors where they don't have scrutiny. And even if the answers are demonstrably false, as we've seen with the FBI's claim that it abandoned the BIE designation, that in and of itself can help build momentum towards greater accountability. So, again, I think it's really worth digging into the indicators and sort of recognizing the Black identity extremism as not particularly important as a designation, except for what it says about a law enforcement paradigm that is really about trying to make Black political speech and organization presumptively threatening. I'll stop there and look forward to questions.
Thank you so much, Omar. I will go ahead and pass to Leola and Carl.
Great. I'm on mute. Can you all hear me? Great. So I just wanted to give a very super brief, in respect of time and introduction to the Water Protector Legal Collective and then some brief comments. So the Water Protector Legal Collective is a legal support organization for Indigenous-led water and earth protectors. And people may know that we were born sort of amongst the tents at the No Dapple protest in Standing Rock in, I'll say in the Great Sioux Nation or in North Dakota, if you're looking at it in a settler colonial way. So, and our work obviously is working to fight against white supremacy, working to fight against settler colonialism. And I really want to say that all of the things that we're talking about, the Black identity extremism, extremist designation, which was sort of, I think, maybe regenerated or given new life because the government was afraid of the Black Lives Matter movement, the anti-BDS legislation that has come out because this government is afraid of the BDS movement in Palestine and here, and the what we'll talk a little bit about here, the critical infrastructure bills and the riot boosting bills that have happened around the country from state to state, which were born from the resistance that was seen in the No DAPL movement. But one of the things that I think is really positive about this, a sort of way to flip it, is all of those things are government and I'll say reactionary, sort of in a double entendre, a reactionary response to people's movements and people's victories, right? Because if BDS wasn't so powerful and it wasn't such a valuable, important movement, there wouldn't be any anti-BDS legislation, right? If the No DAPL movement and sort of its subsidiaries that are spreading around the country, in some ways around the world right now, if that wasn't so powerful and didn't scare the powers that be and settler colonialism so much, there wouldn't be in South Dakota, you know, a riot boosting statute. There wouldn't be legislation being proposed in Texas. There wouldn't be legislation that CCR is fighting in Louisiana. There wouldn't be federal legislation doing the same things, because in ways this is really like, it's the ultimate gaslighting, right? Because people are saying, I'm going to go out peacefully and protest and do it in an entirely legal way and hold my sign and say, stop white supremacy, tear down this statue, get off of our land. I'm going to do that legally, and I'm going to do it the way, you know, I'm supposed to do it under the laws of, you know, what is a settler colonial constitution, but I'm going to do it under that. And then they say, no, you're a criminal. And you say, but I'm not a criminal. This is not criminal. And they say, well, actually, we'll make it criminal. We'll just make what you're doing criminal, no matter what. And if people really see, CCR, I think, has it on there. CCR's Instagram, I just have to say, is popping. It's really nice. So congrats to CCR for that. But CCR, I think, has an image on there. I think it's on their Instagram, and folks can, and if someone could put a link in it, that'd be awesome. But a picture of Louisiana and all of the critical infrastructure that so-called criminal infrastructure, I should say, that goes through Louisiana. And if you're in a certain, you know, range of that, and you're protesting, then you're a felon. Then what you're doing is a felony. And this is just patently outrageous, right? But the thing that I want to say that I think is hopeful for us is all of this is in response to these people's movements, almost all, you know, based in people of color, and very often young folks of color, the victories that we all have won in the recent past. I want to say that on the other side of that is we should, in things that, I was going to say the Koch brothers, but I'll say the Koch brother and organizations like ALEC, things that they're doing, even though that these organizations, at least the Koch brothers, previously the Koch brother now, are at the same time pretending like they're working to reduce mass incarceration or whatever ridiculous language they use on it, and they're funding, you know, some organizations that would sometimes think they're allied with us. At the same time, they're doing things to criminalize protest. At the same time, ALEC is out here saying there should be these bills passed. We should protect property. We should protect extractive resources. We should protect people who are destroying the climate and destroying indigenous sovereignty. And while that's happening, while organizations like ALEC are doing that, they actually see all of us, all the folks who are on this call and all our allied organizations, as a unified force that is challenging systems of white supremacy. They don't see it as challenging systems of white supremacy, they just see it as challenging the system, but systems of white supremacy, challenging systems of settler colonialism. They see us as a unified force. So the thing, I'll put out a call to us. I really think, you know, folks who are fighting for Black liberation, folks who are fighting for Palestinian liberation, and in that, following the call from Palestinian civil society for the boycott, divestment, and sanctions of people, doing business and supporting Israeli apartheid, and folks that are fighting for indigenous liberation, indigenous sovereignty, protecting the water and the earth. We all need to see our struggles as a unified struggle. That's why I was thrilled about this call. I'm thrilled about the work that Law for Black Lives and Law for Black Lives D.C. specifically. Thank you all for bringing this call together, and thank you all for inviting us. But I think we need to see this as a unified struggle. So I'll just I'm just going to put out a little call for us, and I'll put it out with love, is that whenever we mention BDS, whenever we mention critical infrastructure, whenever we talk about the riot boosting statutes, and whenever we talk about Black identity extremists, we leave our brothers and sisters and other folks' struggles as one, because all of this is making all of us and all of our people illegal. And we should say, you're not doing it to any of us, or any of us on this call, or any of our people, because we're going to fight for liberation together, and we're going to win liberation together. And with that, I'm going to pass to my coworker Leola to talk a little bit about some of the work she's been doing organizing here.
Hi, so I just wanted to first introduce Mary. She's also our coworker, so just a shout out to Mary. And so basically you heard Carl, he's talking about the critical infrastructure bills. So those came to life from what the response came to as a response from what happened in Standing Rock in 2016-17. So just to let you all know, what we were doing in Standing Rock was praying. We are praying with sacred medicines, with our sacred fires, and with as peaceful water protectors. And there were no weapons allowed. And in response to that, now we have critical infrastructure bills, which means if we protest near a pipeline, or like the warehouse, the manufacturing, we could be severely penalized for that now. In addition to whatever, charges like trespassing, civil disorder, all these other things. So they're like actually piling up, all these charges against us. And as Indigenous folks, as Indigenous people, it is our obligation to resist settler colonialism and resource extraction. These are our homelands. It is a very sacred relationship we have with the water, with our homelands, and it is our right to protect these areas. So I also want to talk about the Riot Boosting Act that is in South Dakota, and that can carry up to 25 years and $50,000. And so that is being challenged though. And, resource extraction is directly tied to our missing and murdered Indigenous women. You all may have heard about that. Definitely look more into that. When there are pipelines, gas, oil, any type of resource extraction happening on our homelands, it is directly tied to missing and murdered Indigenous women. And also, I just want to talk about, we have, from the No DAPL movement, we have 5 Indigenous water protectors who were federally indicted and who are currently either incarcerated in a halfway house or on home confinement. And those folks were looking at 15 plus years, and they are incredible people. This is what happens when we resist, when we stand up. The charges they're just insane. And one of those water protectors is actually my husband. So it's been a real interesting fight. I've learned so much in being able to be a part of his legal defense team. And we need more Indigenous folks, women, our LGBTQ, to be the lawyers and legal workers for our own people, because we have different needs and nobody understands that more than us. So I believe that's all I was going to say. Oh, and we actually work with a couple awesome, radical, just amazing organizations. Thank you, CCR, for working with us. They helped us put together this awesome chart, which we will put out soon on our website. And it has all of the anti-protesting laws. And we also work with Protect Dissent. And thank you all for your amazing work.
Great, thank you so much. And we will head over to Liz.
Can you hear me? All right, I think you can hear me. So I'm Liz Jackson from Palestine Legal, interconnected with Black liberation, Indigenous liberation, all the movements. We're also supporting activists and activism challenging settler colonialism in Palestine and supporting people in the US who are part of the Palestine solidarity movement and related struggles. So yeah, as Carl and others alluded to, this is a movement that is challenging settler colonial expansion, that's demanding justice and equality and liberation, and a real threat to the status quo in Palestine. And that means that it is targeted for repression, like the other movements of people demanding their dignity and human rights. So it is so good to be in this conversation with you all, and thank you, Law for Black Lives, for organizing this, and everyone for staying this long. I just wanted to kind of briefly describe what the Palestine Solidarity looks like, what is boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and describe how it is being targeted for repression and criminalized, and how we're in joint struggle with you all resisting that. So yes, so as I said, Palestinians are demanding freedom and equality and justice, and many people in the US across movements are joining them. Basically, the movement in the US is mostly focused on boycott, divestment, and sanctions as a tactic to hold Israel accountable to international law. It's student-led, it's intersectional, it's you know, very often focused on three demands, which are to end the occupation, to have full equality for Palestinians living in Israel, and also you know, guaranteeing the right of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes. So you know, this is kind of, it's in response to the boycott and divestment and sanctions movement. Israel has identified it as an existential threat. You know, it's kind of based on international movement to end apartheid in South Africa, which was successful. And Israel has seen that. And as Carl described, you know, the scariest thing is for this to move just beyond Palestinian grievances. Or Adjoa talked about this earlier, but this is, you know, for it to be seen in context with demands internationally and in the US for as a core racial justice struggle is even more threatening. So pretty much the response from Israel has been to smear boycott, divestment, sanctions, and the activists who support it as being across the board anti-Semitic and terrorist. The Israeli government and connected with proxy organizations in the US has over the past few years dedicated over $100 million and announced more, close to $100 million to fight this movement, and especially to target the tactic of boycotts. And also especially allotting money, $100 million for an international legal network focused on crushing boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And there's now a new department in the Israeli government called the Ministry for Strategic Affairs, which is dedicated to this effort and coordinating an international legal effort. And their main initiative is to paint boycott, divestment, sanctions, and those activists as anti-Semites and terrorists. So, for example, the Israeli government recently produced a report called Terrorists in Suits, which attacks supporters of boycott, divestment, and sanctions claims to unmask them because they parade as human rights activists, but really they're terrorists. So this is, again, kind of as Leola was describing, this is attacking people and for their peaceful economic pressure as secretly economic terrorists, or hiding behind human rights work to accomplish their terrorist objectives. And those terrorist objectives are actually seeking to hold Israel accountable to international human rights law. And this is the same Israeli ministry that is bragging about them taking credit for laws across the US so far in 27 states that restrict boycott and divestment in some way. So basically, as a result of Israel's reaction and the reaction of Israeli advocacy organizations in the US, we've seen a kind of massive assault on people in the US who are trying to be vocal about Palestinian human rights. So for example, like a course at UC Berkeley taught by a Palestinian student to think about Palestine and Israel in the context of settler colonialism, attacked internationally as a class teaching students how to drive Jews into the sea. And the class was suspended in the middle of the semester. Or the author of a children's book called P for Palestine, with these really gorgeous, a toddler book basically, with these gorgeous pictures of a young little toddler of color with black hair talking about, a little Palestinian toddler going through her life and talking about Palestinian culture and important symbols, broadly attacked as a terrorist book. Book events canceled, book, hidden from the shelves in bookstores in New York City, all as a result of an international campaign targeting the book. So there's just a couple of examples, but over the past 4 years, we responded to over 1,200 incidents of censorship like this. So I think people may know about the legislation sweeping the nation to target boycott, divestment, and sanctions. I can describe it briefly. Basically, in 27 states, there's legislation targeting BDS in some way. It basically establishes blacklists of companies or entities that support boycott or divestment, and then prohibits state contracting from those companies. And then also in some states, actively divest state funds from those companies. And then other legislation just simply condemns BDS as being anti-Semitic. So all of these laws, again, are designed to chill and get people to self-censor. And, they're being challenged one by one, and there's been some good court decisions so far. But I think as we've talked about in the chat box, challenging this stuff on a free speech basis alone is not going to be enough. Really, we will knock out these laws because they're blatantly unconstitutional, but we have to do much more to kind of go at, what's underneath that is these are not just hate speech arguments that have to be, permitted under the First Amendment. These are people, demanding dignity and human rights, and the rest of us supporting them, that we have, kind of our underlying struggles to challenge and demand justice are worthy in themselves and not just have to be accepted under the First Amendment. So, and there's also a wave of anti-Semitism bills to redefine anti-Semitism as by definition anti-Semitic, and therefore setting it up for censorship. So we're fighting those also, and there's also federal bills both attacking BDS and trying to redefine anti-Semitism. So the final thing, just kind of that's really looking at criminalizing advocacy for Palestine, is more and more accusations that people in this movement are violating material support statutes because they collaborate with terrorists. And again, this is our through line here. The objective is to get people to self-censor, to monitor and destabilize and disrupt our movements. And it's very scary. It does get people to self-censor. The statute is overbroad and terrifying. And, we're starting to see some effects, like a student, for example, a law student, a right-wing blacklist called Canary Mission tweeted at the law school saying, "You have a terrorist student in your midst." And he was pulled out of class by security guards, put in a room alone with 2 FBI agents, and interrogated for an hour about his loyalty to the U.S. because he had tweeted about an assault on Gaza, a Palestinian American student. So there are, while these allegations are on, that people who support economic pressure are terrorists, on the one hand, while that's like insane and laughable, it's not funny when it really does, the consequences can be really serious. And the purpose, where Israel is going with the terrorists in suits idea is to get us to self-censor, and then of course the public relations campaign to justify the repression by framing people demanding their dignity as a threat to public safety because they're a threat to the status quo of white supremacy, basically. So the other through line that I just wanted to emphasize, Carl did somewhat, but this idea that, solidarity itself is the biggest threat. I don't know if people followed what happened with the California proposed ethnic studies curriculum over the past couple of weeks, but, teachers who are really thinking about how to give students and especially young kids of color a good education and get them engaged, proposed some model ethnic studies curriculum. And the Zionist organizations really got upset because there was a few lines in there about boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And there was a huge controversy in California of people just panicking about this and attacking. It was really got blown out of proportion. And what we saw there was just the panic about solidarity itself and young kids of color in classrooms comparing the U.S. border with settler colonialism and in the U.S. with settler colonialism in Palestine, and that was such a big threat. So that is I kind of wanted to end where Carl did, that our biggest strategy for resistance is to keep in mind how powerful this joint struggle is.
Great, thank you so much, Liz. We are right up on time. I just want to invite folks, if you hadn't had a chance to put any questions in the box, to email them over to us so that we can get it to our panelists. And we will share all of the resources that were mentioned on the website within the next couple of days, along with the recording. So you'll be able to find everyone's, the articles that are mentioned and all of that online as well. So thank you so much to our panelists. We were so grateful and honored to have you, and to everyone who joined us tonight.